Welcome to the Young Widow podcast, and thank you for joining today for episode 3, A View into Active Grieving. I'm Brittany, your host, and I'm super excited that you can join. Today, we're going to be talking about active grieving. We're going to go through a detailed insight into active grieving, what it is, what it can feel like, and some experiences. Out of this episode, I'm hoping that you get a view of what this cycle of grief is, a validation in how you currently feel or did feel in your active grieving cycle, which, if you've heard me talk, I believe is important in the grief journey. And then I'm going to go through the top 3 emotions that I feel like were the most predominant within my active grieving cycle, what triggered them, how I dealt with them. And then with that, you'll get some general non-structured guidance from one widow to another. Knowing that nobody's grief journey is the same, I can't give you an answer key to grief, but hopefully something I talk about today resonates with you and it helps you process your current emotions as well. What is active grieving? Active grieving is the phase that you experience immediately after you lose somebody. The active grieving phase can last anywhere from a couple weeks and months into years. It really depends on what kind of loss you've experienced. If you've lost somebody in your second or third network of your social matrix in life, then you likely will experience active grieving phase for a couple weeks into a couple months. If you experience the loss of somebody in your immediate social network, it is likely that you could experience the active grieving phase for years. Specifically for widows, the active grieving phase usually lasts through the first year as you're experiencing your year first and into the second year. Some widows even report feeling like they were in the active grieving phase all the way into the third year. The active grieving phase is a very emotional phase of grief because it's the early stages of grief. It is when you're going to experience a wide range of emotions and you're not going to know how to control your response to them. There could be days where you're going to wake up and feel helpless, and there could be nights where you're not going to sleep at all. Usually in the active grieving phase, you don't understand what a future is. You're not looking forward to a future, and you still haven't fully come to terms with the loss in your life and how to work forward in that grief. I like to say that the active grieving phase is the most physically and emotionally exhausting part of grief, and it really affects your daily life. What does the active grieving phase feel like? To put it bluntly, it feels like hell. I felt like I was dying. Literally, my heart felt like it had been ripped out and my life had completely fallen apart, and I didn't know what I did to deserve this and how I was going to get through it. For weeks and months, I actually didn't think that I survived. When I say I didn't feel like I would survive, those stories that you read on the internet or on journals where a couple that's been together for 50 years, one of them dies and then the other one dies from a heart attack shortly after that. I literally thought that was going to happen to me because my grief and my pain was so significant. I would go to bed at night crying, and then I would wake up in the morning crying. And when I would wake up, I was surprised that I was waking up because the pain was so strong emotionally that it felt physical. It was the strongest physical pain I had ever experienced in my life. And I didn't understand how I could survive it, but I did. I woke up every day. But then when I would wake up, I felt like an empty shell. I felt like I couldn't express happiness. I couldn't feel genuine happiness. And I literally felt like a robot that was just moving through my life and was doing the things I had to do because my body was operating on autopilot, but there was nothing on the inside. Mentally, I felt broken, and physically, I felt broken. And then I felt even more helpless because the grief was so painful that it was physical, and I couldn't go to the doctors to get fixed. I couldn't go get stitches in a cut. I had broken bones before. I had had surgery to fix things before. And after all of those instances where a doctor was involved, I felt better. And in this instance, I didn't feel like there was anything I could do to feel better. I had seen a therapist. I had seen a psychologist. They had offered sleeping medicine and they had offered medicine to stabilize my emotions, but I didn't want to take the medicine, and it could have helped me, but I didn't feel like it was going to fix what was happening. And what was happening was what had happened, and it was my husband has died. And there was no pill bottle that was going to fix that, and there was no doctor that was going to fix that because we've not been able to bring anybody back from the dead. I felt like every single thing in my life triggered a grief cycle during my active grieving phase, looking back at it. my house, my husband's things, mail, keys, shoes, the phone ringing, having to do things on my own. Everywhere I turned, I felt like my loss was being thrown in my face. And it made the active grieving cycle feel like it was something I was never going to get out of. I felt like I was going to feel like this forever, and it was never going to feel better because my husband was gone and I would forever deal with this. And there's no way that I could feel better from this moment. And so, really, summing that up is you really feel in active grieving that there's no way out of it. And you don't think that you're ever going to be able to smile or find happiness again. The movement out of the active grieving phase is usually not intentional. One day you just smile again. One day you just genuinely laugh at something. And slowly you build a daily routine and you do all the things that you need to do because you have to do these things to get through life. And that routine just slowly moves you out of the active grieving cycle as you continuously witness your loss through triggers. Now we're going to talk about the top 3 emotions that I felt like I dealt with in my active grief phase, and they were the most predominant. It's not the end all be all list. It's all based on perspective. But these were very prominent for me and just resonated with me when I was going through the podcast. So the first thing that was one of the biggest emotions that I felt was shock. Flat out shock. I could not believe that my husband was dead. I knew he was dead. I saw that he was dead, but I couldn't believe it. In between the time he had died and the funeral, I was waiting for him to walk through the door. After the funeral, I didn't understand that we had just had a funeral for my husband, and I was still in shock from that. Our whole life was centered around each other. I was supposed to go on a work trip 2 days after he died. He was planning to take me to the airport. And then that week, he was going to go to my daughter's band concert because she had played the saxophone, and he was going to take off work to be able to do that. And those were just the immediate plans. Long-term plans, we were looking at 50 acres of property. He wanted to go back to school, and I was going to work while he did so to support the family. We had these plans from the day he died into weeks, months, and even years. And then he was just gone. It was complete shock. My whole life had torn apart. And then it wasn't just plans, it's that my life had completely changed. I had been married to my husband since I was 19 years old, and at the time I lost him, I was in my early 30s. We literally grew up as adults together. So when I say my whole life changed, I had never been alone. I had never been an adult alone. I did not have to make decisions on my own. I was always supported by somebody. I felt like I had lost my security net in life. You know, the person that you make all of the decisions with, a person that is there to pick you up when you fall down, somebody that can tell you when you're straying on the wrong path or be your cheerleader when you're doing something great. Well, that person for me had just died. And so I was in complete shock because I literally felt like I didn't know how to live alone. And if you're listening to this and you're a widow, you probably resonate with that. If you're not a widow and you're listening to this, imagine the closest person to you in your life, and then imagine losing them, and then multiply that times 1,000. And that's what it feels like to lose a life partner. It is completely devastating. How do you deal with shock, or how did I deal with all of that? I didn't, and you don't. You just let it happen. You are being pushed through the initial shock by reality, literally by time. You cannot heal shock. There's nothing you can do to take the shock away. And time does not heal it, but it pushes you through it. You'll probably be in shock at a minimum from the time your spouse dies, at least until the funeral. And then it can last for weeks into months. I think that my shock probably lasted into a couple months. And I didn't start coming out of the shock until I dealt with triggers, like my husband's toothbrush, and then having an emotional fallout from seeing his toothbrush. Why a toothbrush? Because he would never use that toothbrush to brush his teeth again, and now I was going to throw it away. And then I would cry. I would go through a grief cycle, and then the shock of seeing an item like that would wear off. And I would go through periods of shock and triggers over the first couple of months before I felt like I really moved out of the shock phase. The second very strong emotion that I felt in active grieving was loneliness, and I felt loneliness immediately. So it's to be expected, right? To be lonely because you are a widow. I didn't know how lonely I would feel from the moment that I found out that my husband was dead. I had the most people around me that I had around me in my life. My dad had come into town, my friends had come into town, my friends that were in town came over, people that I wasn't even as close to anymore came over. My house was filled with people, and I felt completely lonely because in that moment of complete, utter despair, the only person I wanted was my husband, but he was dead. And then loneliness, even after the funeral, I felt throughout my whole grieving period. The person that I wanted to call when I struggled with somebody, the person that I wanted to run my ideas past, the person who supported me, and the person that helped me solve problems, well, they're dead and you have to do it alone. Now, also remember that I had lived with my husband my whole adult life. So I had never had to do all of these things alone. I had always had that security net and it was ripped out from underneath me. And bless my friends and family for trying because they gave it their all. They put in as much effort as they could to help me through everything that they could in my active grieving phase, but nobody could feel that void. And that was hard, not only for me to understand, but I think it was hard for them to understand. I tried to show them that I was grateful, but I think that they could tell that they weren't able to give me what I needed. And unfortunately, nobody was able to. And then in that active grieving phase, I felt even more lonely because I knew that I could get comfort from somebody. Everybody usually gets comfort from somebody, whether it's a spouse, a parent, or a friend, and they wrap their arms around you and you just immediately feel safe and secure. Well, that person for me was my husband, and he was gone. And so I didn't feel like I got a physical sense of security and in my active grieving phase, every time I went through a trigger and had an emotional fallout from that, I wanted my husband to pick me up off the floor. I wanted my husband to hug me and tell me, it's going to be okay. You don't have to cry right now. We're going to figure it out. And he couldn't do that. And so I was going through the shock of losing him by experiencing my triggers. But then after I experienced my triggers, I would immediately feel a surge and overwhelming presence of loneliness and feel like I was just here in life to live alone. Loneliness is probably one of the hardest emotions that I have experienced in active grieving, but I actually still experience and struggle with today. And so I was looking at the layout of this and was going to give, unstructured recommendations and guidance for loneliness, but I can't tell you how to deal with your own loneliness. You can fill it with family, you can fill it with friends, and eventually, there will be more times where you will feel surrounded by people that love you than you will feel loneliness. But even 4 years into grief, I still experience loneliness. I mean, this was just in my life last week where I went through a day where I just felt alone. And I knew that if my husband was here, I wouldn't feel alone, but I just felt alone. And so there's not really a coping mechanism for dealing with loneliness itself. I can tell you what not to do though. One of the things that probably isn't the right answer in loneliness is to work yourself to death, which is something I do. It's probably not just to jump into a relationship right away because you still haven't experienced and witnessed the full spectrum of your grief. And so you can't dedicate your time to somebody else. You need to learn to be happy with yourself. You need to learn to be okay just existing by yourself, not having to coexist with somebody else. And eventually the loneliness will fade over time. The third very strong emotion that I felt in my active grieving phase was feeling overwhelmed. And damn, did I overwhelm myself aside from how grief just overwhelms you. In the early stages of grief, you have self-imposed overwhelming feeling, and then you have an overwhelming feeling that's just imposed by grief. The one that's imposed by grief, there's not much that you can do about, right? From the time that your spouse dies, you're overwhelmed with the amount of things that you have to do. You have to plan the funeral, settle the estate, close their bills, close accounts, reconcile banks, file taxes. I mean, the list goes on. And that is overwhelming in itself and emotional because you are literally closing out the legal aspect of somebody's life as their surviving spouse. And then there is the overwhelming portion that you can put on yourself. And for me, I did that a lot. It was how I coped. And I actually still work a lot now because this matrix of my life that I've created. I stayed busy. I made lists on lists. And it is something that started probably 2 days after my husband died. I started making lists of things that I had to do for the funeral arrangements. He was in the military. People had to fly in from out of town. My family lived out of town. His family lived out of town. And I'm a habitual list maker. It's how I get things done. And so I had started making lists, except for those lists didn't stop after the funeral. They continued. And every single thing I had to do, I put on a list. And it was a list for things I had to do because my husband died and things I had to do because my husband did die and I was alone. And so I had to take care of his whole life. Then I had to take care of my life and our daughter's life, grocery shopping, laundry, working, getting my daughter to school, to band, soccer practice, the dogs. All of these things went on a list, and I would just fill up pages of a notebook and I would go down the list. And at the end of the day, I would feel accomplished based off of how many things I took off of the list. But then in the morning when I would wake up, I would look at the list and I would be overwhelmed. But then my trauma would kick in and I would say, but you have to go through the list because your husband died and you are here alone and nobody is going to go through that list for you. So start ticking down the lines. And I would do that. And I would go through the cycle. And I went through this cycle for weeks and months. And so I really caused a level of an overwhelming feeling in grief on myself. And it's because that's how I cope. I had overwhelmed myself emotionally and physically. And then when I was emotionally overwhelmed, I was physically overwhelmed. And it was this circle that I couldn't break out of. It took me a long time. I still work a lot through my grief. It's still a coping mechanism that I use, but I'm aware of it. And because I'm aware of it, I can face it better. And so what do you do? One baby step at a time. That's my best guidance for if you feel overwhelmed, what to do. Take it one step at a time. And I wish I would have done this. And I'm telling you to take it one step at a time, and you could be rolling your eyes and saying, yeah, but you didn't do it. So, how do you expect me to? But let me just give some small recommendations in what one step at a time actually means, because you still have to carry on your whole life, right? Give yourself credit for the small things. I didn't give myself credit for doing enough. You closed one of your husband's accounts today. You reconciled the bank accounts. You took care of the death certificate. Give yourself credit for that. And then don't feel like you have to do more, because you don't have to do more. You don't want to make dinner today? That's okay. Order out. A lot of people don't make dinner. One thing a day is okay. 2 things a day is okay. If you want to get through 5 things, that's okay. But what you should do to get around that overwhelming feeling is set aside a period of time in the day where you can just sit with your emotions. I didn't do this in my active grieving phase, and I got really good at it in my growth phase. And I schedule time for myself to sit with where I am at today and how I'm feeling. And if I would have done that in my active grieving phase, I feel like I would have been less overwhelmed and I wouldn't have put as much on myself. I'll also say that in that overwhelming feeling, you don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be stoic, and you do not need to maintain what your life was. I'm going to say that again. You do not need to maintain what your life was like with 2 people. I was overwhelmed because I felt like I had to do everything for both of us, but I'm one person. I can't do what 2 people did. It is not physically impossible in a 24-hour day to do what 2 people did. And I didn't comprehend that. He was gone and I felt like I had to fill in. And that sense of feeling like I had to fill in is what really made me feel overwhelmed in the active grieving phase. So that would be my top recommendations on how to deal with an overwhelming feeling. If you stuck with me this long, that was all probably a little overwhelming and emotional. It was emotional for me to revisit as well. Whenever I talk about my active grieving phase, I feel like I'm almost transported back to it, and I can feel the pain that I felt during that period of my grief. So the overall intent of the podcast today was to give you a brief insight into active grieving, talk about some of the emotions and experiences that I went through in active grieving, and then give you just some general guidance or tips along the way, knowing that there's not a lot you can do about the active grieving phase. If you are listening to this podcast and you're a widow or you lost a significant other, I hope this gave you some validation in your feelings of how you're currently feeling or how you did feel in your active grieving phase. Validating your emotions is really important in the grief journey. When I became a widow, I wish someone would have shared emotions with me on this level. I wanted the raw picture of what I was going to feel like and what I was going to experience, which is the whole intent of the book I wrote and the podcast. And so we're going to keep going down this trend. I'm going to be very open and very raw. So next week, we're going to do a deep dives into specific topics within active grieving. I think it's really important to dive deep into little triggers and really work through those. The topic for next week is going to be centered around the label of being called a widow, what it's like to call yourself a widow, what it's like to be labeled a widow, and how that's really emotionally impacting on your life for years to come. So I hope I see you next week, and thanks for joining today.